Hey guys, Doll Chick here. I'm gonna go on about rooting some silicone today. First of all, you need to make sure that your rooting tool or needle is oriented the right way. I've got one of these wooden needle holders, and I made marks where I should hold it. So and I'll show you a couple different ways. So in this particular direction, I line up my thumb. If I'm gonna hold it this way, my thumb goes at the tip. I marked it kind of like you would a point on a board that you're going to cut, just so that I can orient my fingers no matter which way I decide to hold the needle. Then on this side, I made a small mark in the wood where the back of the needle actually has to be inserted. It's important that all of this is being lined up because it dictates where the barbs are on your needle. On the plug-in itself, I made a mark on there which side the needle, like exactly where it needs to be aligned with. So if it's off to the side a little, we undo it and I line it up to make sure the needle is flat like the line. And then you just put it back in, make sure the needle is facing the mark you made on the top of the tool. I have a really hard time holding my needle in the same direction. So having all this marked out helps me reorient it whenever I find that I'm not able to pick up hairs with my needle. It's usually because I have, once again, turned that needle the wrong way. At any rate, if you already root and you already have a needle holder that you're comfortable with, by all means, carry on with the thing. And the other thing about rooting silicone is the smaller gauge needles. I take a very small gauge needle. These are 46, I want to say 6-barb needles. First thing you want to do is clean your needles in a trash piece of vinyl, or I guess you could use silicone too. These needles in this bucket are already cleaned. I went through and cleaned them all when I got it. So here's one that I got from factory. This is a larger, I want to say 38 gauge needle. But when you push it in there, it will leave machine oil behind. This particular needle doesn't look like it was too dirty with machine oil, but you can still see the gray spots. You don't want those spots in your silicone any more than you'd want them in your vinyl. So I just take like a limb or whatnot I've got laying around in vinyl and clean that off of there. Again, you could use maybe some paint thinner or paper towel, but then you get the fuzzies stuck in the barbs. So I just find that the best, easiest way is with a piece of vinyl. So before we get into this video, I just wanted to take some time and point out some appreciation, if you will. The angle at which the camera has to be and how everything has to be set up in particular is very difficult to root around all of this setup. And in this case, I was in a very uncomfortable chair that I don't ever use to sit in to root. And then, of course, making sure the camera can see what I'm doing. It can be quite the challenge to make a video. Yes, I know my rooting table is a mess. Half of it is a painting table driving on. And oh, by the way, don't pick on my fingernails either. They're dry, they're broken, I get it. But it is what it is. I've been worrying more with making dolls and taking care of my nails, clearly. All right, so getting into this rooting thing. Sorry. Getting into this rooting thing, my needle tends to be bent because I bend them on purpose. It is so that the needle will stay parallel to the silicone while I am rooting. And I guess you could kind of keep the needle parallel in the way that you hold it, but again, I have trouble holding it just in the right direction overall. So if I bend it, it not only helps to keep that needle parallel, but it also helps me orient it and keep it in the direction to which it goes. So that is why when you look at this needle in particular, it is in fact bent. And silicone, you can kind of see where the needle goes in and out of the silicone there. I don't root it super deep, because here's the thing about silicone. It's not necessarily about the depth down into the head. It is about the overall depth of the hair into the silicone. That is to say, I keep it to the surface, however, I still bury the needle just as deep as if I were rooting this all the way down into the middle of the head. The reason I don't root it all the way down to the middle of the head is because the entry point of the hair is absolutely crucial to how that hair is going to lay. That is to say, when I put the hair in, I don't want to press down on the silicone. And as you can see in this particular part, sidebar, I'm having trouble grabbing a hair, and it's because I have twisted the needle the wrong way. Once again. So once I reorient it, like I said, there is a bend in the needle that you can see. It is because I need that needle to bend to stay flat against the silicone rather than coming at a 45-degree angle. And with rooting vinyl, that 45-degree angle, or some people make it a little more shallow, that works. It works just fine. The hair will lay down just fine. That absolutely will not work with silicone hair. You cannot root that way. The hair will stick straight up out of the baby's head, and then the only way to get it to lay right is some kind of hair product or something. But once someone has that baby in their possession, they're not going to restyle that hair the same as you. So in my mind, it's a little bit of a false advertisement to do that, to use gels or whatnot to style the hair in their pictures that you're selling them with when the hair doesn't actually lay that way. Maybe I'm just being a particular jerk about it, I don't know, but in my mind, the hair should lay natural. Baby's natural hair can stick up out, that is true, but most of them that I've looked at, and even my own children, it lays with a natural pattern. That's the point in directional rooting, after all, is to create that pattern. So again, you're keeping that needle pretty shallow, or at least I do. It does not make the hair fall out. This idea that hair has to be sealed to stay in is actually kind of a misnomer anyway. I have had heated vinyl to where I've rooted it too shallow. It didn't poke through the other side, and there were tails sticking out. And so I had noticed these tails sticking out after I had already rooted the hair, and I knew full well that particular hair was not rooted all the way through the vinyl because I could see part of it at the top of the vinyl. In other words, because I started rooting with silicone, it's been a really hard habit to break with the vinyl to actually root it deep, not shallow. But nonetheless, that hair that I had rooted shallow, I couldn't get it to come out once the vinyl was cold. So heated vinyl will close back up around hair the same way that silicone does. Silicone, of course, there's argument whether you can or cannot seal it. There are people that will dip their needle in wet silicone and then root, and I'm not going to go to those lengths. I'm just going to root the hair in a way that it lays flat to begin with. So if you pay attention here, I've got a hair that did not go in right. I pushed too hard on the silicone and it sticks straight up out of the head. So I'm pulling those out, both of them. That's not acceptable to me. Again, the hair has to lay in a natural position. And in the case of mono rooting, which honestly, I'm not sure why you would root any other way with silicone. I mean, these are expensive dolls. The quality of everything should be a bit more than a vinyl doll, I guess, in my mind. And again, it can be really time consuming. Mono rooting is in fact pretty time consuming all by itself, but on silicone more so if you're not comfortable with doing it. But you can see there how the silicone wrinkles around the needle. You can see just how shallow that needle goes. But in respect to the hair into the silicone ratio type idea, the hair is going deep into the silicone, as in it is like they're inch-wise on the ends of the hairs. They're going in just as deep as if you would to root at a different angle. And that's the important part, because silicone, when you're rooting it, it opens up, you shove the hair down through there, and then it's held in place more or less by how far into the silicone it has gone. So this part where I decided to fuzz out the camera is because there was actually 2 hairs in the hole, and I decided to take one out because mono rooting is just that, mono rooting, 1 hair, not 2. And this is what takes me forever to root too. It's just kind of making sure I've just got 1 hair. But each time you see the needle go in, you can see how shallow it actually goes in, and you can see that even dry, the hair is laying the way that it should lay. I don't need water to style it. I don't need, any kind of gel product, and that's the way I believe it should be. If it's not going to lay flat dry, then you did it wrong. if you can see, like, there's lots of videos on rooting that show you to pull out just one hair at a time to root. The main important thing with all that is that you pay attention that the needle's only grabbing one hair. It doesn't necessarily mean that one hair has to be sticking way out away from the bunch. In the case of silicone, and you'll see maybe, static electricity will move the end of that hair. It will bounce it around, so it can become kind of difficult. This one here, there's 2 strands, so I stopped part way out, separated one out, and pulled it with my fingers. It's easier to do it that way than it is with tweezers, but just be cautious, because when you're pulling it out with your fingers, oftentimes I will find that the hair will break. It will not pull out, it will break. So I am adding a little water here, just kind of to show where that pattern is going, why I'm rooting it the way I am. And basically it's because this is kind of mid forehead, and I want the hair to not just gather in the middle, but also to swoop to the side. So if my hair that I want to swoop to the side is already angled that way, then it makes it much easier to style the baby's hair. You don't have to sit there and pick at it for 2 hours to style it. You can kind of brush it and go. The other point in doing this is looking at the base of the hairs. Sometimes I will miss that I've rooted 2 hairs, or there will be 2 hairs so close together that it appears that there are 2 hairs in one follicle. I will choose one and rip it out when that is the case. And the other thing about silicone is when you put the needle down, when you're narrowing down, you're pinning down your hair so that you can put it in there. And I guess now that I think about it, this concept applies to vinyl too, and that is that your needle is not going to push the hair in necessarily where the tip of it goes. In other words, when you're looking at the tip of your needle, yeah, you're going to make a hole, but that hole is going to end up down a little further as far as like the hair and where you actually wanted it. Or maybe that's just a me thing. That might just be me being a little bit retarded at what I'm looking at. Not entirely sure there, but I can tell you with silicone, the hair itself, if you have a properly matted baby, it can and does slide forward before the needle picks it up. So, learn to work with really placing that hair where you want it. And that one did the same thing. It's kind of, not only did it not quite catch with the needle, I mean, yeah, the tip of it pulled it down. But then, you get it down in there and it's a little bit lower maybe than intended. I think, like I said before, I think really the big deal with rooting silicone is directional rooting. It is absolutely necessary. You're going to want that needle to be parallel to the silicone while you're rooting. You don't want it perpendicular. As far as the gauge of needle you use, I would recommend you get used to using a very small gauge needle, because your larger gauge needles, when you bend them, they tend to break. Now, that is not to say you can't use them. You could, but you'd have to, I think, purposefully bend them. My needles get organically bent as I use them, and then it just is. So this part I wanted to show following a line, and here's the thing about it. When the needle goes in at the entry point, that is the angle at which you need to worry about. So note how this one is going in, but then it's going way outside the line as it goes up into silicone. That's fine. What's not fine is that there are hairs sticking straight up, but which I should have known simply because the needle, when I rooted those 2 hairs, it did push down quite a bit on the silicone. When you push down and you make a dent in the silicone, you're effectively changing the way that hair enters the silicone. So yeah, your needle is flat against the silicone, but now that you've pushed down on it, it's more of a 45-degree angle than it is straight on. So when you're rooting, you just have to try to be careful and not push down into the silicone. So if you can see, I'm not making an indentation with the needle until after the hair has entered the head. And that's super important to get the right direction. Honestly, I dare say that's the number one key, the absolute key to getting silicone hair rooted nicely is not pressing down on the silicone while you're rooting. You want to put enough pressure to trap the hair with the needle, but not enough pressure to make an indent on the silicone itself. Directional rooting maybe even takes on a whole different definition where silicone's concerned, because the directional rooting, I'm not talking about necessarily which way the hair points. I'm actually talking about the direction at which it enters the silicone. With vinyl babies, that's not so much of a concern. It really is not. And you know, this shallow rooting is what actually really messed me up with vinyl rooting, because I tried to root it shallow, and well, you all know, or should know, how that goes, and it ends with a happy trail on the top of the head that you can see and a hair that did not poke all the way through. But with silicone, you don't have that worry. You want that rooting to be as straight on as you can, and so it is kind of a shallow root under the surface. But I promise you, the hairs that I have shallow rooted like this are just as difficult to pull out as the hairs that I root at an angle and have to pull out. In other words, hair that I have purposefully shoved way deep down inside the head, it comes out just as difficult as the hair that is shallow rooted. With silicone, again, it's not about how deep, as in deep into the head, the hair goes. The depth that you're looking for with rooting silicone is that the hair itself goes into the silicone, you know, all the way up to the needle. And in that case, like up to where it starts to get thicker. But that doesn't mean down inside the head. You could, if you wanted to, once you get it started on the surface, pull up on your needle and root it down into the head, but then you're making a great big hole. Like, you'll lift up the silicone and make a larger hole in that silicone. And I can tell you, hairs that I've rooted that way, they were easier to pull out when I made a mistake. And that's why in the very beginning, why I stopped rooting that way, because I realized that enlarging that hole was definitely making it that the hair was falling out much easier, essentially. So again, you can see the line that I made to root with. You can actually see the needle under the silicone in this case. You can see the dark line that it makes while it's in there. Pretty shallow rooting. But at the same time, like I said, the hairs that are rooted shallow like that are just as difficult to remove as hair that was shoved way down in deep. It's not about shoving it deep into the skull of the baby. It's about making sure the hair gets deeply into the silicone. How far down into the silicone that is irrelevant, it turns out. It's just the simple fact that you need to have the hair into the silicone itself, regardless of the depth downward into the head. The depth you're looking for is the depth of your needle. You need to make sure, just like vinyl, that you get the needle shoved in there far enough that the hair will hold. I like to push my needle all the way up to where it loses its gauge. And what I mean by that is I have a 46 gauge needle, and when it starts to enlarge, I stop there. But I make sure that the hair goes all the way into where it starts to enlarge. And that's just to make sure that it's planted well, and has less of a risk of falling out. I think that's about it. The uncomfortable position I was rooting in, I'm actually pretty satisfied with what I rooted in there while I was doing it, so I'm not going to pull it out. And once Grumpy's done, I guess we'll update his full rooting job and see how we did. Thanks, guys.